Did America build pollution around black communities? When people think about environmental racism, they often picture smokestacks, power plants, oil refineries, highways, landfills, and factories surrounding predominantly black neighborhoods. But was this simply just merely a coincidence, or was there a historical process that made these communities more likely to bear the burden of pollution? After reading through decades of historical, economic, and public health research, I found that the answer is far more complex than people realize. So let's start with what actually happened. Many black communities didn't simply just choose to live beside smokestacks, power plants, refineries, highways, landfills, sewage treatment plants, freight corridors. Throughout much of the 20th century, racial housing covenants, discriminatory zoning, federal mortgage redlining, and residential segregation severely limited where black families could live and where they could receive financing to buy homes. Neighborhoods with black residents were frequently labeled as financially hazardous by federal housing programs. Because these neighborhoods were denied investment and assigned lower property values, they became politically and economically easier places to acquire land for industrial development. And at the same time, local governments often zoned black neighborhoods for industrial or high density uses while protecting wealthier white neighborhoods through restrictive residential zoning laws. This is a real reality. Now, it's important to be accurate here. Researchers haven't found one nationwide government order that simply said, hey, put pollution next to black people. That's not how it happened, at least on paper and, with the information that we could pull from in order to prove it as 100% certain. Instead, I view it more as a structural process. Redlining directly reduced home ownership. It lowered property values. It weakened neighborhood tax bases, and it diminished political influence. Developers and industries naturally sought inexpensive land, especially land located near railroads, near ports, near waterways, and existing transportation infrastructure. Government officials also frequently anticipated less organized political resistance from neighborhoods that already experienced decades of disinvestment. Once a refinery, a highway, a warehouse, or a power plant was nearby, property values just declined even further, and families that had the financial means to move frequently, they did, while many families who had been excluded from other housing markets, they remained. That created a cycle where industrial facilities and disadvantaged communities became increasingly concentrated together over generations. Now, some people might say, is there evidence for this? Like, what are you talking about? Is this verifiable? Yes, it is verifiable. One of the strongest studies was published in Nature Energy in 2023. Researchers examined 8,871 historically graded neighborhoods across 196 American urban areas. After accounting for power plants that already existed before redlining, they found that neighborhoods receiving the worst federal redlining grades were 72% more likely to receive an upwind fossil fuel power plant between 1940 and 1969, 20% more likely between 1970 and 1999, and 31% more likely between 2000 and 2019. Today, those formerly redlined neighborhoods also experience approximately 82% higher nitrogen oxide emissions, 38% higher sulfur dioxide emissions, and 63% higher fine particulate matter emissions from nearby power plants. Now, this doesn't prove that every individual power plant was intentionally placed for racial reasons, but it does provide a strong nationwide evidence that the housing system helped determine where polluting facilities were eventually built. Now, the evidence doesn't just stop there. That's only one example. There was another nationwide study covering 202 American cities, and it found a nearly perfect stepwise relationship between historical federal neighborhood grades and modern air pollution. And neighborhoods that received the worst federal grades, They had average nitrogen dioxide concentrations that were 50% higher than neighborhoods receiving the best grades. And researchers also found that racial disparities persisted even within the same historical neighborhood grades, suggesting that redlining was only one part of a much larger system involving, highways, industrial zoning, freight infrastructure, ports, and ongoing residential segregation. And I view it in this way. It's not just about, power plants. It's not just about, the fact that houses were built next to power plants. It's about the national research that examined pollution from industry, from vehicle traffic, construction, agriculture, electricity generation, and they found that people of color experienced an above average pollution exposure from nearly every major pollution source. Black Americans in particular, they experienced disproportionately high exposure to diesel traffic pollution, to industrial emissions, and pollution associated with electricity generation. So naturally, the next question at that point would be, well, what does all this pollution do to the human brain? So I think we should use precise language. Scientists generally don't talk about polluting people's minds or pollution affecting somebody's mentality. They talk more specifically about neurodevelopment, cognition, behavior, and mental health, not mentality in terms of like your personality. Pollution can't create a single black personality or a, black cultural attitude, but widespread exposure can shift the statistical distribution of attention, learning ability, emotional regulation, and an increased psychiatric risk across entire populations. Amongst all the pollutants, lead perhaps has the strongest evidence. Lead interferes with developing neural circuits. It damages your neurotransmission and it alters your brain development. Childhood lead exposure has consistently been associated with lower IQ, weaker working memory, poorer reasoning ability, attention issues, and worse long-term educational and occupational outcomes. Even at exposure levels that were once considered relatively safe, you still see these negative downstream effects. One study following participants for 4 decades found that every additional 5 micrograms per deciliter of childhood blood lead corresponded with approximately 1.6 a 1.6 point reduction in the adult IQ, even after researchers accounted for childhood IQ, maternal IQ, and socioeconomic background. And, there was a particular study that was conducted in New Zealand where historically disadvantaged American communities have often experienced, greater lead exposure from deteriorating lead paint, contaminated soil, aging plumbing systems, and emissions from industry and transportation. There's also the reality of air pollution, which affects the brain. You have fine particulate matter, diesel soot, some people say soot, black carbon, and they're so small that they actually penetrate deep into the lungs, and these particles promote inflammation throughout the body. They damage blood vessels, and they may even cross into the brain itself. And researchers believe these pollutants activate the brain's immune cells, called microglia, and that could potentially disrupt your brain development. And a Boston study found that children with greater exposure to black carbon performed worse on tests that measured verbal intelligence, nonverbal intelligence, and memory. And, researchers, they can't eliminate every possible social factor. What they can do is they can adjust for, certain socioeconomic differences. I've looked at some studies where they had these compounds, called PAHs, and these pollutants come from vehicle exhausts, industrial combustion, heating systems, tobacco, smoke, and electricity generation. And scientists monitored pregnant African American and Dominican women living in Harlem and Washington Heights and the South Bronx. And when their children reached age 5, those that had the highest prenatal PAH exposure, they had 4 IQ points lower, 4 IQ points lower, than children without exposure to these things. So the evidence extends into adulthood as well. It's not just with the children, but long-term exposure to fine particulate matter has been associated with increased risks of depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, dementia. So the evidence is all there. Researchers believe, chronic inflammation and damage to the blood vessels supplying the brain may contribute to these outcomes. And, most of these studies are observational, meaning they show increased risk rather than, direct correlation or direct causation. But it's still a reality that exists, and it's still something that's worth talking about. And now that I'm thinking about it, there is another pathway that people often overlook. Living beside highways, refineries, freight corridors, smokestacks, and things like that, it also means, people might downplay this, but it does mean constant noise, unpleasant odors, asthma attacks, disrupted sleep, financial stress from illness, and sometimes that feeling that your neighborhood, has been treated as like something disposable. It's not really going to lend itself in a positive manner. And chronic stress itself affects your hormones. It affects your inflammation. It affects your attention, your emotional regulation, your anxiety, your depression. And even traffic noise alone has been linked with, sleep disruption, psychological stress, and increased attention problems in children. So could these environmental burdens have influenced broader social outcomes? At the population level, the answer appears to be a resounding yes. If thousands of children experience even small reductions in working memory, attention, impulse control, learning ability, those small individual effects can accumulate into larger differences in school performance, graduation rates, employment opportunities, and overall contact with the criminal justice system. Lead exposure in particular has been repeatedly associated with greater risks of behavioral problems and delinquency. You also have the cultural aspects as well. The fatherlessness, that's a big problem. Certain negative aspects of the hip hop culture that reinforce these cultural attitudes. People observe the 2-allele MAOA warrior gene that's most commonly found in black men, and it's less commonly found in Caucasian or Asian men. And there are correlations with negative behavior with that as well. And one might assess, where are these genetics coming from? Is it just merely the race? Well, there's a clear line between area, environment, and what's going on in that environment, and some of these outcomes, and that's a big reason why a lot of Nigerian students who are more, African than African Americans, if it was really purely racial, then that wouldn't exist. These Nigerians that are able to achieve the same scores as a lot of Europeans and a lot of Asians, and a lot of these tests. So a lot of people might only want to focus on race. It just so happens to be that there is a particular race that's being exposed to all of these, contaminants. And even if race were real and certain races are smarter than others, well, why is it that these environmental factors have to put some group that's already lower, even lower? So that's my take on all of this. I think these environmental exposures increase the risk of population level, cognitive declines and attention issues. And, my thoughts on all of this are basically we should try to uphold the living circumstances for everybody. If we're all Americans, if we're all human beings, if we're all just people, then I think we should look out for one another.